Hello, everyone. Most people associate mummies with ancient Egypt. But what if mummies are as old as human civilization, or maybe even older? Right now on the channel, I'm brought on Peter Bellwood, who is a co-author on a recent paper in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences by Hung et al., titled Earliest Evidence of Smoke-Dried Mummification, more than 10,000 years ago in southern China and Southeast Asia. Peter Bellwood, welcome to the podcast.
Very good to be here. Good morning.
So your paper, you're one co-author amongst a large group of collaboration. Currently, you are a researcher at the Australian National University, and this project spans multiple institutions. Can you talk about who was involved in the project?
Yes, sorry, I am still drinking my cup of tea here, but yes, we have there are 23 members altogether from
Okay.
many different countries: China, Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and so forth, and Australia. Xiao Chun Hong, who is the leader of the project, is a senior research fellow here at the Australian National University in Canberra, and she has led the research with two colleagues, Hirofumi Matsumura, who is a Japanese biological anthropologist based in Sapporo University, and Zhenhua Deng, who is an archaeologist based in Beijing in China. And all of the other members have contributed mostly access, of course, to ancient remains that are stored in museums and university repositories in many of these countries. So what we're looking at is a body of information about ancient people whose skeletons have been recovered by archaeologists in many different places, in the ground, buried in a very tightly bound up posture with their knees and hands right up under the chin, very, very tightly. And the oldest ones that we've been dated directly are 14,000 years old. The oldest ones that we have tested for heat and smoke treatment are 12,000 years old, and these are in southern China and Vietnam. So this is all about ancient people who wanted to preserve their ancestors and how they did it.
So when I was reading the paper, and for people that are not aware, there is a long-standing puzzle in Southeast Asia where they find people buried, like you just described, in this bent up, hyperflexed position, like a squatting posture. And these burials are found all across Southeast Asia, and they're dated to like the end of the Pleistocene. So like you said, 12,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Placing them way before mummies found in Egypt and elsewhere around the world. Yeah. And these mummies are found from 12,000 years ago all the way up until modern people apparently seem to have practiced this up until recently. And there's evidence of this mummification in the hyperflex position using smoking. So I want to begin with, what methods did you use to prove, first of all, the age of these mummies and that they were smoke dried, not necessarily burned or just air dried? How could one determine that from a burial that old?
Well, the two methods were used, two highly technical physical methods. I do not do this research myself. One of them is called, Fourier transform technology. The other one is X-ray diffraction. And those, of course, have to be done by specialist laboratory people working in laboratories. They're not archaeological skills. The Fourier transform and X-ray diffraction work was done through Zhenhua Deng and his colleagues in Beijing. Those physical methods of analysis allow, by looking at the crystal structure in the bone, basically, to determine what sort of temperature the bones might have been heated to. And some of the bones do show actual burn marks. They are black, but only in small areas. So this is not cremation. They weren't trying to burn the bones in a cremation. This has nothing to do with cremation. I think what happened is the bones were or the bodies were suspended over fires, and sometimes the fire blazed up or the body fell in. We don't know, but somehow small parts of the bones got burnt. And these physics techniques also demonstrated the application of quite high temperatures to certain areas of these bones. Now, what I think I would say here is that, okay, we have these people, and I might talk later on about who they were, but for the moment, we have these people who clearly respect or respected their dead ancestors and wanted to keep them somehow around their lives rather than just disappearing. Southern China and Southeast Asia are fairly wet climates. Well, you're in Honolulu, so you'll know all about that. It rains for part of the year and it's humid. It's not very easy just to desiccate a body. You can try, but carrion and predators, of course, are going to be a problem. If the body is suspended over a fire that is kept burning for many weeks or months, that will certainly deter carrion and predators, and it will also dry the body out more quickly. Another reason why we think they were doing this is that some of these burials are so tightly bound up that there's no room between the bones for any flesh. Now, if they were buried as fresh cadavers, I mean, of course, we have flesh on our bones, and the cadavers would not be so tightly bound. So the archaeologists who excavated, mostly Hirofumi Matsumura, who studied these skeletons, were able to see that the bones, that they're all in articulation, or nearly all. Again, I can talk about that in a moment, but they're too tightly crushed together to have had any flesh surviving on them. And that does suggest that they were encased in dried skin. The skin doesn't survive. We have no skin or hair in this climate. This is not like Egypt or the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. It's not dry like that. You can't just desiccate a body in the natural climate. So those are the techniques that we use to determine that they were applying heat to them and smoke, and sometimes, probably by accident, burning small parts of the bodies.
Okay. And this is all revealed by looking at the mineralogy of the bones. And actually, there's heat-induced changes in the mineralogy that this FTIR and XRD actually can pick up, which I thought was a really interesting finding in the paper, because it actually shows that they weren't totally burned.
No,
they must have been smoked, because if they were burned, it would have been too hot to, it would have over-induced the mineralogy or erased what they had seen. Okay, and so now tell me about how these mummies are dated.
Radiocarbon,
go ahead.
Direct radiocarbon dating. Human bone, of course, contains collagen and carbon-14. Well, radiocarbon dating, I don't think I need to explain. Again, I'm not a radiocarbon dater, but it's all to do with the decay of carbon-14. And the bones, in some cases, if they contain collagen, they can be dated. They can't always be dated. Sometimes the preservation is too poor for radiocarbon dating, but many of them do have direct dates. I think the oldest direct date is about 12,000 years. So that's as far back as we've gone at the moment.
Remarkable.
Yeah. So these are humans who were deliberately preserving their...
And those are older than Chinchorro, too.
I've been to northern Chile. Yeah, the Chinchorro mummies, I understand.
Yeah, older than Egypt, older than Chinchorro.
Don't forget, of course, in a place like Egypt, there are in the desert desiccated human burials, not formally mummified in the way that Old Kingdom pharaohs would have been mummified, but certainly desiccated bodies survive in Egypt into the pre-dynastic period. But actual mummification of the intentional kind, of course, it is, I understand, it starts sometime around the Old Kingdom, maybe a bit earlier, because there aren't any mummies from the very beginnings of Egyptian history. Oh, I would add here, we're talking about mummification. I mean, for me, mummification is drying out and preserving the body. People have asked us, did they pull out the internal organs like the Egyptians did? Well, of course, we don't really know because we've only found bones. But ethnographically, in the New Guinea Highlands and in parts of Australia, People were doing this when Europeans arrived. And in Australia, there are records back from the 19th century of people smoking there, not necessarily in this position, but although this position does occur in Australian ancient cemeteries, but they were smoking them, and they would also pull out some of the internal organs and make holes in the flesh for fluids to drain and things like that. So there, in terms of ethnography in Australia, there was some degree of removal of internal organs. And that, of course, was also the case with the Chinchorro mummies as well. They took out much of the inside of the body and put frameworks of sticks in. In this case, we don't have frameworks of sticks because they were buried as skeletons. I presume what happened here was that the mummy would start to decay, and they would have been clever enough to know that if they didn't do anything, then predators and carrion would simply destroy the whole burial. And of course, they would have realized that the only way to preserve a human burial is to put it in the ground in a reasonably deep hole where no other creatures can get at it. And that is clearly what they were doing. They were burying them deliberately. And sometimes we can see that some of the bones had come loose, and they often put them back, but they were not anatomists, so they often put them back in the wrong position. And there's one famous one in southern China where the skull is actually inside the chest cavity. The head must have fallen off it, and they stuffed it back inside before they put it in the ground. So yeah, there's a high degree of intentionality about all of this. No, it's not. This is not an accident. They were deliberately preserving presumably their ancestors. And none of them show signs of killing. I mean, this is not. These were not victims of warfare or anything like that.
And they were all buried in this squatting hyperflex position, the unique characteristic.
Well, there may be,
right?
Yeah, all the ones that have been examined are in, because it is such an unusual posture. Now, it is found in some other parts of the world, not commonly. There's a famous cave site in Brazil that has a lot of burials like this. Whether it's connected, because of course, first Americans come from East Asia, we all know that, and did some of them bring this tradition across Bering Strait, which is obviously how they got to America in the first place, and then down into South America? Well, maybe they did. There's a lot of genetics debate about that, but that's probably not something to go into right now. But there's a very high density of them in Southeast Asia, and they all belong to one period. They belong to the people who lived in this area before the farming populations who were growing rice and millet with pigs and dogs came in from mostly, well, I think entirely southern China. And of course, some of those people became the Polynesians and the Hawaiians and the Maoris and so forth. I mean, that is a later migration. And those farming people, speakers of Austronesian or Thai or so-called Austroasiatic languages, they didn't practice this kind of burial. They simply mostly put their burials on their backs in the ground or on their sides and put pots and stone axes in with them. These earlier people with the burials folded up, they've never put objects in the graves. They were not interested in grave goods. In other words, there are no Tutankhamons. There's nothing like that. We don't find, sometimes we might find occasional stone tools.
Yeah.
But then a lot of that could be accidental. They could just be part of the soil that filled in the hole or something like that. So we really don't know. We don't see offerings to the dead.
Okay. And now this is interesting, the squatting posture, because in the contact period, like you mentioned in New Guinea and Australia, the Dani and Anga groups smoke preserved their dead. And there's actually pictures of these. Yes. And they look remarkably similar to the burials you're finding in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And so that suggests some sort of at least cultural connection, probably genetic connection between early migrations of humans into Southeast Asia. And would this suggest that the Anga and the Dani are maybe they're like almost refuges of the earlier groups, and they were kind of the ones left after the displacement in the later Holocene by the farming groups of
you are
China and what have you.
saying, of course, there are several hours of detailed lectures about what happened in Southern Asia through the last 50,000 years. I can try and summarize it. Okay, now nowadays, most geneticists, and I think most archaeologists now, would suggest that Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens like us, came out of Africa through Arabia into Asia 55,000 years ago. Before that, of course, Asia was populated by Neanderthals, Denisovans in the east, maybe even some archaic Homo sapiens in places like Israel that haven't transmitted genes to present populations. But the main population, especially of Eurasia and, of course, Northern Africa, that exist in the world today appears to have spread out of China about 50,000 years ago. Now, that population, I think, and I think many archaeologists think, split into two movements. One of them went tropical along, India, into Southeast Asia, into Australia, New Guinea, up into southern China. They are the people who left behind these contorted burials. And Hirofumi Matsumura does some statistical analysis of their cranias in terms of their cranial shape and facial shape. They are clearly related to modern populations in Australia. I'm talking here about indigenous populations, of course, Australia and New Guinea. And let's not forget, the New Guinea Islands were never reached by the farmers who came out of Asia. They weren't even reached by Europeans until the 1930s. They're incredibly remote. They have very dense populations of Papuan people who developed their own farming without rights. Farming with yam and banana and taro and things like that. They didn't have domestic animals, no pigs, no dogs. And they were developing agriculture and very complex cultures in the highlands long before Austronesian-speaking people like ancestral Hawaiians came through into Polynesia. So that southern wave of Homo sapiens early movement brought those people. Now, we don't have any burials from 40, 50,000 years ago in, let's say, Arabia. So we don't know what they were doing then. But we do know in southern China and Vietnam, by 14,000 years ago, they were burying these tightly bound bodies. The other population who became dominant in northern China, of course, they migrated through the steppes north of the deserts and mountains of Asia, came out in Mongolia, northern China. They are the people today who we talk about, who we see as Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, and of course Thais and Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian people who come from these much later migrations of farmers, and most of the Polynesians, except in the islands around New Guinea, because that Papuan population that developed its own agriculture in the New Guinea region also spread into what the islands we now call Melanesia, the Solomons and Vanuatu. But these burials, I think, are part of this. They're part of the ancestry of a huge sweep of ancient peoples who did eventually become the Australians and the Indigenous New Guineans. Of course, the first, Hirofumi Samura talks about two layers here. The first layer is the one that peopled the whole area with the people making these burials. Quite how far north they went in China, I'm not sure. The team, I think, is going to investigate that. And to have got to Japan, because in the so-called Jomon period in Japan, which is before the arrival of the Japanese, there are burials of this type, but none of those were analyzed in this project, not so far. So I think, yes, there is a huge depth of shared ancestry. Now, that doesn't mean that the burials we're finding in Vietnam were direct ancestors of people who once lived in Australia. This is a shared common ancestry over a very large area. Actual threads of direct descent from genetic descent are more difficult to follow, but my understanding here is that in terms of DNA, these folded burials, although they're not identical to indigenous people in Australia and New Guinea, they're also not identical to the farmers. I mean, they have their own DNA lineages, and it seems that they are potentially very strong candidates for being part of the population that did ultimately give rise to the present day indigenous Australians and Melanesians, New Guineans.
And The thing that really kind of blew my mind about that whole connection, though, is just the length. I mean, we're talking 12,000 years of history.
Yeah.
Are potentially, or traditions
Yeah.
up until at least European contact when they made it to the highlands,
Yeah.
which is pretty remarkable. I mean, you think about traditions going back a few thousand years, but this suggests that those groups in New Guinea and
Mm.
Australia potentially were carrying on the same tradition for 12,000 years.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't know, that's pretty cool. That's
Mm.
really, really remarkable.
Yes,
It
it is.
kind of also reminds me myths and stories and traditions can last in cultures over thousands of years.
They
And
can.
that to me is just,
Look, my view here,
it's amazing too.
I write books about human prehistory around the world, and I see the human past as, generally speaking, mostly quite stable, without a lot of change. I mean, I'm talking here about, the prehistoric human past of small scale. I'm not talking about Greeks, Romans, and Industrial Revolution, but small scale tribal societies of the type that would have been living in Paleolithic and Neolithic circumstances. Their lives were very stable. And I think when they became unstable was when other groups moved in and impinged on them. And in some cases, of course, in the colonial era, pushed them off the land and caused all sorts of, disastrous events from the indigenous perspective. And I think that's what's been happening here. This tradition just went on and on and on we don't know exactly when it started, but it went right on until the arrival of the farming peoples who became the present day Polynesians, Filipinos, Thais, Khmer in Cambodia, Chinese, Koreans. When all of those groups from the north with rice farming, millet farming, domesticated pigs, very large populations, because agriculture produces lots of people if it's done properly. It can support huge 8 billion people in the world today, mostly entirely fed, I suppose, by agriculture. So when those great spreads occurred, mostly after 5,000 years ago, and in the case of the Pacific, of course, most of the migrations of farming peoples into Polynesia started about 3,000 years ago. But before that, yes, this hunter-gatherer tradition just continued. There was no reason to change it. In the case of Australia, it continued until Europeans arrived. And we all know, of course, what happened then. There was a disastrous change across the whole continent, same in Hawaii, same in the Americas. So, yeah, I think there is a kind of inertia in human behavior. People like to follow traditional ways of life. They just do. They like to speak their traditional languages, and they like to behave as their ancestors did. And they don't particularly like being told, no, you can't do that anymore. And also, we'll take your land and you can go and live somewhere else and join our culture or something like that. No, those things are not.
Yeah.
So I think that's what happened here.
I love how that little quote, people love doing what their ancestors did. And you can really say that for up to the present with our culture, and we want to continue what we've been doing. If you mess with that, we're going to be very upset.
Yeah. That is why
the people that left these hyperflex burials since 12,000 years ago, they're long gone. They've been displaced. But we do have maybe insight into their culture with the Indani and Anga traditions with these smoke-dried mummies. Can you tell me a little bit about the ones we know about and what they believe about the human spirit and mummification and why they did it?
Well, I haven't been to the New Guinea Highlands or seen these burials. There are a number of ethnographic accounts that discuss why they did it. In the case of Australia, I mean, there are accounts of taking there's one interesting one from South Australia where the relatives would take a piece of the thigh skin of the dead person, give it to a sorcerer to try to find out why the person died and if anybody else was guilty. I mean, I don't know the details of this, and they've gone now. I don't think. In ethnography, there are these kind of accounts. In the case of the New Guinea Highlands, I'm not sure. Xiao Chun has told me that some of the groups up there, they still keep them secretly in caves or hidden places. So they must still revere them. The one in the photograph in the paper, I understand, is just kept in the village and brought out to show to tourists and so forth. People are probably no longer feeling the same as they might have done 100 years ago about it because they're coming into the modern world. So that sort of information has gone. But I think, as far as I can tell, it's just, I mean, what did these people believe? We'll never know, but they certainly were not scientists. They probably believed in all sorts of supernatural forces, and they wanted to keep their ancestors, relatives around, maybe for protection. It's very hard to say. An anthropologist who studied this sort of stuff in detail might have more ideas than I would, but I don't have any clear ideas about why. And as I said, with these burials, we don't find artifacts. There's nothing, there's no skin or hair, and they didn't put things in the graves. They're just bones in little, small, often round pits sunk into the ground, bodies put in the bottom, then the soil's put back in again, often in a cave. Sometimes we find large numbers of them underneath shell mounds. I'm working on a site in Vietnam with colleagues at the moment, central Vietnam, and there's a layer of these burials at the bottom, and there's a very big shell mound on top, so that when people were first using the site, it was clearly a cemetery, and then they decided to, for some reason, to stop burying people there, and they began to pile up shells over the top. Probably they were living on the shells as a sort of a mound next to the sea. And these are all, of course, hunter-gatherer people. They were not farmers. They were hunting deer and wild boar and wild water buffalo, the animals that live in this area, and fishing, doing a great deal of fishing. They were eating tubers like wild yam and taro, and the starch grains from those tubers are sometimes found on the ends of stone tools. So we know that they were eating tubers. There's no trace, of course, of things like rice and millet in these sites. They come in much later with the Neolithic populations who came in as farmers and brought in the domestic pigs. But yeah, I mean, the reasons for keeping the dead, most people, I suspect, see their ancestors as having a protective function, as I understand it. In societies like Polynesian societies, of course, ancestors were very important because they gave people rights to using land and their status in the society. Because Polynesians had stratified societies in the case of Hawaii. That probably wasn't the case with these populations, but ancestors might still be seen as having considerable sort of supernatural power. But beyond that, we can't say a great deal, and probably we never will be able to.
And maybe the concept of thinking of immortality, immortalizing somebody via mummification.
Yeah.
And is that a common thread maybe between Egypt, this, and the Chinchorro?
I have to say, I don't know. At the Chinchorro, as I said, I've been to northern Chile and seen Chinchorro mummies, but the Chinchorro were not recorded ethnographically as far as I know. I don't think they were. That tradition wasn't going on when Europeans arrived in Chile. As far as I know, it's a dead tradition. In Egypt, of course, with the translation, with the ability now to read hieroglyphic Egyptian, yes, there's a lot of information about where the dead went and what they were supposed to be doing in the afterlife. I'm not an expert on that, but it was a culture that was very much obsessed with keeping alive the past, not just with humans, but with animals as well. We haven't found any animals in Southeast Asia buried like this. So it's only humans in this case.
Only humans. Okay. I believe the mummies are dated to a lot later during the Inca period.
Yes.
And they're up in the highlands of Peru. And they're those mummies that were almost frozen, freeze dried with coca leaf, and they're
Yes.
digestive system.
And young women. Yeah,
So
yes. Caves.
was
Yeah.
that a mummification? Would you
Well,
count that as?
would you call that mummification? I've seen,
Mhm.
yes, pictures of young women sitting on frameworks with textiles over them.
Mhm.
Yes, I mean that is
Exactly.
drying. I do not know if those bodies were treated or if they were just put there as sacrifices to deities. But no, they are very famous, and of course there are also lots of them in Western China in Xinjiang,
Yeah.
in the desert there. Yes, those are 2,000-3,000 years old. They're not as old as these southern ones, and they're different because they've got all their clothing and hair, and that is total desert. So of course everything is preserved. Again, I do not know how they were treated, but they they have become very famous recently because some
Mhm.
of them have fair hair, and they seem to be of West. I mean, the DNA has been done on them, and some of them, of course, have Westerly rather than Chinese origins, and because Xinjiang is a crossroads area between Western and Eastern cultures in Asia.
Oh yeah, I think I do remember seeing something about that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I guess with the Incan mummies, the children, I think there was this at least ritual prior to them being either sacrificed or killed, where
Mm.
they were eating a lot of
Yes,
coca and other
yes,
things that they think maybe were part of a fasting or some sort
mhm,
of ritual
mhm,
pre
yes,
freeze dried mummification on the top of the mountain that's cold and dry.
yes.
So maybe that would be kind of like a ritual
I think so.
mummification,
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean,
but I
that
don't know.
there will
Border.
be people who will know about this, but I'm probably not one of them. Yeah, yes. But this is the only case.
Uh, okay. I think I'm fascinated by the fact that these mummies can be or these burials go back so far. They go back almost 12,000 years, and that then to me suggests there was a big change in human culture at the end of the Ice Age to the beginning of the Holocene, right at that Pleistocene boundary, the Younger Dryas
Yes,
boundary.
yes,
Can
yeah.
you speak to what the changes were happening in the late Pleistocene in Southeast Asia?
Well, in Southeast Asia, I suspect probably not a great deal happened at the end of the Ice Age. Of course, the climate became warmer and wetter in most parts of the world. But these cultures, these people were using flake stone tools. Some of them in Vietnam polished the edges of the stone tools, and some of them made a very simple kind of baggy pottery as well. Not all of them, but some of them used pottery. Exactly what for is not clear. Some people think it might have been for storing some fish product, or maybe just boiling shellfish or something like that. But in Southeast Asia, yes, in the say between the end of the last glacial maximum at 18,000 years ago and about 12,000 years ago, although the climate changed and the sea level rose, but that was very important because it produced much inshore productivity, kelp and coral reefs and things like that. The sea level was very far out during the last glacial maximum. But when the sea level rose and the climate warmed, then big things did happen. They didn't happen in Southeast Asia, but they certainly happened in the Middle East, and they happened in Central and Northern China, and of course in Central America, Mesoamerica, with maize. And that was the period when wheat and barley and rice and pigs and cattle and sheep and goats all became domesticated, and huge farming populations developed. I suspect it did have something to do with the warming after the last ice age, because there's no sign of it before the last ice age. Not really. People make claims, but even the settlement of the Americas, of course, well, in my view, was certainly after the last ice age, about 16,000 years ago. I don't think anybody was there before that. If they'd been there 30,000 years ago, they'd still be there now. Because there were so many naive animals available for hunting that the human population would not just have died out. So I mean that increasing temperature after the last ice age, 20,000 years ago at its maximum, did, I think, play a major role in the development of agriculture. Exactly how it did it. I mean, hunter-gatherers, they became larger in numbers because there was a greater amount of food growing on the landscape and along the shorelines. And as numbers grew, humans would have to congregate in larger groups. There would be tendencies to falling out and fighting, but also tendencies towards perhaps overexploitation of resources if populations were growing. And those sorts of situations might have led people to start doing what we think of as food production or agriculture. In order to domesticate crops like wheat, you have to harvest them deliberately. You have to replant the seeds and look after them. And you also have to undertake certain activities to allow the naturally occurring seeds of the wild stands that do not shatter or fall out when they're ripe. You have to somehow collect those for further planting to produce the domesticated cereals. Tubers are a bit different here, but to produce domesticated cereals, you have to select for a non-shattering genome, which they probably did by waiting for the end of the harvest when the seeds that were not going to shatter were still on the ears, and then collect them and plant them. Whether they knew about this and did it deliberately is a big debate, but they did. And of course, eventually, if you go to somewhere like central Turkey and look at some of the sites like Göbekli Tepe, built 11,000 years ago, huge great stone circles and monuments with carving, these people were becoming the first farmers. And there's a huge change in the nature of the archaeological record. But Southeast Asia, no, this tradition, Southeast Asia was not a source of cereal farming or animal domestication. Central China was, the Yellow River, that was hugely important, and to perhaps a slightly lesser extent, the Yangtze River. But further south, there's no evidence for any significant development of food production. Even the pigs and dogs, I think, would have come from further north.
Okay. And then so before 12,000 years ago, how were people buried?
Well, we probably the same way. Yes. Now, the team, Xiao Chun and her colleagues, say that the museums in China do have skeletons from older excavations that were buried in this way. And now they want to go on further to analyze them. Some of these apparently could be
Same way.
Yeah, some of them could be as much as 30,000 years old, but they haven't yet got onto that aspect of it. I don't know how many of these burials there are, but
okay. Now I kind of want to switch gears and talk about a recent study I have come across.
Yeah.
And the person, I don't remember the name of the researcher, but I'll bring it up on the screen.
Yeah.
They analyzed hydrocarbons and other proxies in sediment cores from the ocean off of Southeast Asia.
Right.
And these proxies are very sensitive to fine smoke particulates.
Yeah.
And they find that off the coast of Southeast Asia in the ocean environment, there's an increase in the proxy for fine biomass burning material that's deposited in the ocean starting 50,000 years ago. And it kind of increases there and continues slightly upwards until present. And they make the case that 50,000 years ago is the beginning of modern humans entering Southeast Asia, and they changed fire regimes.
Yeah, I would agree.
Are you aware of the study, and can you
I'm not,
comment on that?
I would agree. Yes, 50,000 years ago is a good date. Now, some of my other colleagues have been excavating caves and rock shelters in the eastern islands of Indonesia, and they've published a couple of papers recently. They dig down in these caves to hit the bedrock. And usually on the bedrock, the oldest dates are just over 40,000 years ago. There have been suggestions that Australia was reached 65,000 years ago, but I think that is luminescence dating, and I think it's the contexts are not very stable. So what you're saying, yes, modern humans, who of course knew how to make fire, mind you, so did Neanderthals, but modern humans certainly knew how to make fire. Yes, they would turn up and so I've got to stand up. It's a bit of cramp in my leg. They would have had a major impact on the landscape. Yes, I'd be interested to see that paper.
Fires.
It is in proof somewhere? Is it in? It's not out yet. Is this paper out?
It just came out in, I believe it was Proceedings in
PNAS.
Proceedings in National Academy of Sciences.
PNAS. Yeah,
just came out.
I'll have a look for it. Yeah, no. I'm not at all surprised. 50,000 years ago, I think, is when they did arrive. This is the ancestors of the indigenous Australians and New Guineans and Melanesians, and the small people who are often called Negritos in the Philippines and Malaysia and so forth. Yeah, yeah, that is a major. That is a major date. And it may be that, of course, these burials go back to that phase, but we haven't found any yet that we've dated as old as that. Hopefully, somebody will.
Well, if the evidence is true that burning biomass increases 50,000 years ago, that places humans impacting perhaps the carbon cycle and maybe, aerosols in the air way before even the LGM. And to me, that, that kind of pushes the debate of the early Anthropocene hypothesis from William Ruddiman, who suggests that the advent of rice agriculture led to methane increases in the early Holocene. But the evidence from this core shows 50,000 years ago, biomass burning inputs were changing. Maybe it didn't affect global carbon concentration, CO2, but it affected at least burning in, land cover changes and smoke composition in the atmosphere can affect clouds. But that pushes it way before LGM.
It was Bill Ruddiman who I've got his book here somewhere. What is it? William Ruddiman, an American paleoclimatologist, who suggests
clouds, plagues, and petroleum.
Yes, all about methane. And of course, methane now from the permafrost in Russia and so forth and in Canada too, I suppose, is a big issue. Yes, I mean, Ruddiman, I think, is right. If you want to, I don't use the term Anthropocene myself. I'm well aware that there've been incredible changes in the last, few hundred years, but they're not really what I study. But certainly, yes, humans can change the environment. Yes, especially if they've got fire and there are plenty of them, and they're cutting down trees to grow crops, and they've got animals grazing and all sorts of things. Of course, they affect the environment. Yes, greatly. No, I agree. I think, yes, somehow modern humans behaviorally were not the same as Neanderthals and Denisovans. And even though our ancestors could interbreed with those two species, we know that from genetics, but they still replaced them in the world. And so modern humans have a greater capacity, I think, for, I suppose, intelligent interference with the environment, if we can call it intelligent, than the earlier hominins who are now extinct. So yes, and it is, and for me, I live in Australia.
Oh wow, that's profound.
I'm just going to say here, I live in Australia, but I'm of British origin, of course, and I'm always amazed that Aboriginal Australia, as it was in, say, 1750, before Europeans settled here, was a cultural tradition that had been not entirely separate, but to a high degree separate from the rest of the world for 50,000 years, of course. Then we know that people did come across in the north, across Torres Strait and so forth. But Tasmania was very isolated, especially from the last 10,000 years when the sea level rose. And yet Tasmanians were, when Europeans arrived, Tasmanians were hunter-gatherers, and they had complex cultures. Many Europeans communicated with them and recorded their lives. What happened to them was very tragic because, of course, the Europeans and their sheep simply took the land away and the languages and brought in diseases, and we all know the disasters that occurred. But those Tasmanians were heirs to an amazing tradition, 50,000 years, that they developed themselves in quite a cold part of the world. They were not living in the tropics. Tasmania is nowhere near tropical. And they survived for 50,000 years with culture. Some people say they didn't know how to make fire. I think they did, because many of the early drawings of them show the men carrying smouldering fire sticks. They certainly had fire. And quite how they got it, whether they made it themselves, I do not know. I suspect they probably did, and no Europeans ever actually recorded it. But that is quite amazing that people in this part of the world could still be the fairly direct descendants of those first Homo sapiens coming out of Africa 50,000. Well, we're all direct descendants of that period, but some of our ancestors have moved more than others. I mean, it's all to do about how far did the ancestors move? All of us come from Africa, but we have different trajectories of getting to where we are now. That's really the way I see it.
Speaking of different directions and let's say of evolution, I kind of want to change directions. Do you know much about the Homo floresiensis
Yeah, yeah,
and Hobbit
yes,
found in
yeah,
Flores,
quite a lot.
the
I was,
alleged
I was
so-called
involved
Hobbit?
in the Luzon one, but the Midi Mijares,
Yeah.
that Callao cave. I wasn't there when they found the Luzonensis, but I was there when the excavation was being done because the Philippine guy in charge of it was a former PhD student of mine, like Xiao Chun. Yeah, yeah. So I'm familiar with that.
Wow. So that's the type, that one from that cave is the type specimen for Homo
Liangbois,
floresiensis, I believe,
yes,
right?
yes, yes, yes. Small bones have been found in other sites, but that
Hmm.
has the partial
Um,
skeleton of the woman who was found lying on her side, but she wasn't folded like this. She's not part of that tradition. No, she was, I think, lightly flexed. I think the idea is
okay.
I don't know. I'm not sure how she died. She fell into a pool of water or something like that. But she's not part of this mummification tradition.
And sorry, is this a Hobbit
Yes,
you're
we're
referring to?
talking about Liangbois, the cave in Flores, Homo floresiensis, or the so-called Hobbit. Yes, yes. That's
Yeah,
originally a female skeleton, the first one found. More teeth and
that's a
parts.
female skeleton,
Yeah.
but they're not in a flex position. They're in a
I think she might have been slightly flexed. I can't
okay,
remember, but she wasn't bound up. She wasn't folded like the later ones. And she's not
okay.
for Homo sapiens.
And the dates on that are
They've changed, but now they're between, I
right,
think, 100
right.
and
But what are
150.
the dates on that?
The one in Luzon.
Okay, 150,000. Now, okay,
And the big question, of course, is who were they? Were they Homo erectus who became small in small islands, which happens to big mammals? They get smaller in small islands.
yeah.
Or do they descend from some other lineage that came out of Africa, not Homo erectus, but maybe some sort of late Australopithecine, because their hands and feet, I gather, are somewhat Australopithecine-like. This is going back 2 million years ago. This is not 50,000. This is 2 million years ago, the first hominin movements out of
Hmm.
Africa.
Hmm.
Yes. Do the hobbits represent a separate stream from Homo erectus, or are they simply a dwarfed member of that species? I'm not a paleoanthropologist. I'm not an anatomist. I'm not have no strong opinion, but it's an interesting debate. But those people were not part of the mummification.
Where would you fall? Yeah, and so where would you fall on the camp? Do you think it's more of a Homo erectus stuck on an island effect, or was it a whole separate
Yeah,
species?
I don't know. I don't know. I know people who have opposing points of view. Yes, a good Japanese colleague says it's a Homo erectus, a small one. But I have a colleague here, Debbie Argue, who insists she does the phylogenetic mathematical calculations and things. She says no, it's much more. It's not Homo erectus. It's more perhaps related to Australopithecus. I cannot adjudicate that because I don't have the technical knowledge of the statistics. It all comes down to, well, archaeologists find these fossils, paleoanthropologists put them into species, but how real are the species and how different are they from other species and could they all interbreed anyway? Well, we don't know. But of course, going back 2 million years ago, there's no ancient DNA. So the oldest ancient DNA is the Cima de los Huesos in Atapuerca in Spain, which is 430,000, all those little burials pushed down a very dark, deep shaft. So yes, it's all mysterious and often quite confusing as to what was going on in the world, particularly before the arrival of Homo sapiens, where people came from. But those little hobbits, of course.
Are you aware of Gregory Fourth and
Yes,
his
I know.
book
Oh, well, I haven't
about the
read.
Hobbit?
Yeah, yeah. So all about little people in central Flores. Yes, and mythology. Yes. Well, there might have been some surviving, of course, until the arrival of Homo sapiens.
Hmm.
Some of the interior peoples of those islands, modern humans, are quite small. Even New Guinea, there are pygmy people in the highlands, very short stature, because humans do seem to shrink when islands are small. Well, not that New Guinea is small, but I don't know what causes it, whether it's some dietary factor, but humans can become smaller if they live for a long period in the interior of a small island. Now, I haven't read Gregory's book. I met him many years ago. But I think, and of course, there was a claim once that the hobbits were not ancient humans at all. They were just modern humans who had some deficiency, some disease, and I've forgotten the details now of what it was all about. But nobody, I think, seriously accepts that anymore. The hands and feet don't fit modern humans. So even though the cranium could look like a tiny sort of very tiny brained modern human, but of course, with pygmy people today, short people, when they are short, like Negritos, the brains don't shrink in size. The body might, but I don't think the brains shrink right back to chimpanzee size. Because that Homo floresiensis, the brain size is the same as that of the chimpanzee. So that suggests, well, I don't know what it suggests, quite frankly. I'm not the person really to give deep opinions about this, but they're very interesting questions.
Now, I had Greg Forth on this channel to talk to him about his book, which I did read.
Yeah.
And I asked him directly, and he has not observed a hobbit, but he spoke with firsthand witnesses, and I read the accounts. And based on his interactions, he speaks with the people from Flores in Indonesian, which is their language. He doesn't speak through an interpreter, but they do have their own indigenous language.
Yes.
And his gut feeling, and I have it recorded, and you can check it out if you're interested. His feeling is that they're telling the truth, and that up until at least contact, there were small bipedal beings that lived in the highlands of Flores, and they were separate. And he even thinks that some of these interactions could have happened up into the mid 20th century.
Yeah. Well, I can't comment on that. I mean, I do know the people who've been doing these excavations, and they're still excavating. There's still research going on the island now. I mean, small bones like those of hobbits have been found in other sites in Flores going back to the Middle Pleistocene, 500,000-600,000 years ago. So that species is ancient. Yeah, I mean, how long it survived after the arrival of Homo sapiens. There is another case that you may be aware of in Africa. Homo sapiens was widespread in Africa by 300,000 years ago, but there's a cave in South Africa, Dinaledi Cave, that's got lots of bodies of quite large body-sized humans, but with very tiny brains. They've never been found anywhere else. They're not found with any archaeological artifacts. The excavators think they might have been put there deliberately as burials or offerings. And they're only 300,000 years old, which in Africa, of course, is very recent. How did they survive amongst people, other hominins ancestral to us with much larger brains and much more complex cultures? Perhaps they did. Perhaps no one took any notice of them if they couldn't communicate with them. And they just ignored them and left them alone, unless they wanted to kill them to eat them or something. But there is no evidence for that. We don't find hominin bones as part of food remains. So it is a mystery. Yes, it is. But whether they lived into the 20th century, I really can't say. Like many of these myths about yetis and things living in dense forests hidden. Yeah. And of course, modern humans have survived.
Yeah.
Well, I once researched in an island called Morotai in Indonesia, and this was in the early 1990s. And the Morotai jungle, which is very dense and not sort of totally penetrated, still apparently 20 years after the Second World War had a Japanese soldier hiding in it. He eventually came out and long dead now, but he was able to survive in there for 20, 30 years after the war before he was discovered. So it's possible.
Wow, that's amazing. And, of the places in the world where a small population of a human species could survive would be a place like Flores in Indonesia, because we see like pockets of orangutans live there up until recently.
Well, they're in Borneo.
Komodo dragon, a very weird, large animal.
Well, the Komodo dragon.
Oh, yeah, Borneo. But on those islands, in island environments like that, you find these refuge populations.
Reptiles.
So it makes sense to see them in Flores if it was true.
I've been to Flores. Because there are volcanoes in the center of the island. I've been up one of them. the one near Ende. I haven't been to Liangboa. Yeah, yes. I mean, in potentially it's possible. Well, but it is quite a long, narrow island. I would be surprised if Homo sapiens was there for 50,000 years, which apparently it was, just left these hobbits entirely alone. They might have done. They're very hard, unless someone finds one in a very recent archaeological situation, which I think Gregory's been trying to. He's been trying to get archaeologists to go and excavate a mound in a village somewhere or something like that, where people say that they might have been buried. I don't know what happened with that. If any excavation ever was done, I presume it wasn't, because I'm sure if it was and they found some
Oh,
hobbits,
wow.
we'd know about it. Yeah, we'd all know about it by now. Yes.
That's interesting. The accounts that Gregory has in his book from firsthand witnesses
Yeah.
and his experiences with them are, it's pretty shocking. Like, one account is somebody hit one of these hobbits with a car,
Mm,
and he was talking to somebody else about it, and he went to go reference that with the other person, and that person that was there and actually saw it, and they were really terrified at what they'd seen, because originally they thought they hit a pig, and they got out and they
mm,
saw it, and it was on two legs, and they thought they had hit a person, and it changed their view of the accident, because he makes this distinction in the book, the
mm,
distinction between animal and humans,
mm,
because
mm.
the reaction they had towards hitting, if they hit a pig, they wouldn't have felt that way. But when they saw it two-legged and looked like
Yeah.
a human, they were thought they had killed somebody.
Mm,
And I don't know exactly, I can't remember all the details of if that being scurried off or they never recovered it.
mm.
But that was one account he has in the book. And he's like, this was a two-legged, and they're like, yeah, it was a smaller person. Another thing they bring up is that they have longer feet, and independent
Yeah.
accounts that he has, they talk about over decades. He goes, what did you notice about him? They always bring up large feet.
Yeah.
Now,
Well,
that's a
long
really
feet.
weird
Yeah.
detail to bring up.
Their feet were long. Yeah, the bone, of course, foot bones have been found. Yeah, they're longer than modern
Hmm.
humans. Yeah, yeah. They're more like Australopithecus, I understand. But no, it's all very interesting. But
Hmm.
that, of course, is not connected with the mummification.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, we should be clear. I wanted to ask you as an
Yeah,
expert and
it's a
and an
different topic.
anthropologist,
Yeah,
because
mm.
I've had this on the channel, and it's almost a fringe topic, but
Yes,
it's being done by a real researcher.
yes.
And
Gregory
I
is.
brought him on the channel to really grill him, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
he's held firm.
yeah, yeah. Yes,
Hmm.
I've met him, and I know he has this opinion. I can't really say. I'd be very surprised if they were really, given the number of people who live, farming people, rice farmers and so forth on Flores for several thousand years. I'd be amazed if a creature like that could survive and not leave some evidence. Like, I don't know what sort of evidence, but something clearer than just folk tales, basically. Yeah. But who knows? Okay, well, I hope I've answered all your questions.
Well, I want to wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I want to wrap it up and say, your paper, for those that tuned in maybe later on, the paper you co-authored on earliest evidence of smoke-dried mummification more than 10,000 years ago in southern China and Southeast Asia. It sort of smashes the myth that mummies came out of Egypt. It
Yeah.
seems as though mummies are a fixture in human societies for thousands of years, maybe to the dawn of civilization. And the oldest ones are found in Southeast Asia.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
And so it was that kind of changed the way I looked at the world. And it's fascinating to me that these smoke dried mummy traditions may have continued on in these areas like New Guinea and Australia up until recently. And there's some pictures. To me, it always blows my mind, the continuity between ancient societies and how far it goes back, and then modern ethnography.
Yes. Okay. No, that is. I think it's a very important discovery. Yes. Um, of course, we don't know what happens in the rest of
Mhm.
the world. Many people might have known about these techniques of smoke drying and so forth, but we just haven't found evidence. We're all aware of the Egyptian ones because they're found with, well, the later ones are found with beautiful treasures and huge pyramids and monumental structures. So, of course, they are deservedly world famous, and they always will be. The Chinchorro ones are also quite remarkable, but so far none of them go back quite as far as these early smoke-dried ones. But I would say again, in this case, we have only found the bones. We do not find artifacts with them, but we have found the bones, and they do reveal through laboratory analysis traces of deliberate heating and sometimes occasional burning that might have been accidental. So we think that they were smoke drying the mummies and folding them, keeping them, maybe carrying them around when they moved from one location to another, keeping them in the communities until they began to decay, in which case they would have had no other option but to bury them in order to preserve them forever. Yes, it does show us the social side of ancient human life that otherwise is not preserved because we have no written records that refer to this phase at all anywhere in history. And the oldest written records in Egypt and Mesopotamia are only between 4,000 and 5,000 years old, so they're much younger than this tradition.
Very nice. Well, thank you, Peter, for joining me on the channel. Before you leave, do you have any projects or papers that we should keep a lookout for on the horizon if we're interested in this subject?
I've just sent in my latest book. It's actually a revision of a book that I wrote or published in 2013. This is First Migrants, Wiley Blackwell 2013, and on the front is the famous Polynesian canoe called the Hokulea, which is probably still, I saw it when it was first built in Honolulu in 1976, but this book is now, I've completely rewritten it. It'll be called First Migrants Revisited, and it will come out with Wiley Blackwell early next year. So it's about global human migration everywhere. I'm also involved in working with colleagues in central Vietnam, as I said before, on the excavation of a site that has large numbers of these folded, contorted burials. They will be excavated, cleaned up, and probably will become eventually part of this project in terms of the possible traces of mummification and smoking that might survive on. And that's it, really. I have to say, I retired in 2013. I'm now 82 years old, so I am not a frequent field worker anymore, but I still keep up with what's going on.
Very good. Well, Again, thank you, Peter, for coming on the channel. It was wonderful talking with you. Bye. Whoa, check out Lake Erie at Bluff State Park. If you enjoyed this video, I'd like to ask you to please like it or subscribe to my channel to support science communication. Or you could also check out my book, Great Water in the Lost Mines of Lake Superior, on Amazon and Audible. Now back to Lake Erie.